The Yugoslav Wars were arguably one of the most intense flashes of conflict the European continent experienced after the Second World War, but their origins run very deep, traceable all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and even, if we had the time for it, to the creation of Serbia itself in the 9th century. Of course, for our purposes, we don't have to look so far back, but it's absolutely true that the discussion of Yugoslavia is intimately connected to the evolution of Serbia throughout modern history. The Kingdom of Serbia back to the 1910s had, as a result of its victories in the First and Second Balkan Wars, doubled in size and been gripped by the concept of irredentism and pan-Slavism, the idea that Serbia was destined to unite the South Slavs into a greater Serbia or eventually a Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was established after the First World War as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a monarchy that took advantage of the collapse of the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire and the volatile nature of Balkan politics. Yugoslavia had problems with almost all of its neighbors, though, and further, it was set back by internal disagreements among the big three ethnic groups of, naturally, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The Croats and Slovenes tended to aspire to a federalist model in Yugoslavia, which was largely ignored by the Serbian elites, who wielded vaster political authority over the state. The ethnically Serbian king of Yugoslavia, Alexander I Karađorđević, after he imposed a royal dictatorship in 1929, attempted to force together a new Yugoslav identity upon the inhabitants of his kingdom, but things quickly derailed once the Second World War broke out. Behind the scenes, the outlawed Communist Party of Yugoslavia was putting together its own network. Josip Tito was Secretary General of the party and utilized the political vacuum left by the 1941 Italo-German invasion of Yugoslavia to become the sole force of reconstruction during both the insurgency efforts at war and in the post-war reorganization of power. Smartly, Tito built a coalition that wasn't only communist. He integrated nationalists and partisans into what he called his vision of brotherhood and unity, which attracted many when contrasted with the brutality of the alternatives, the Axis-friendly government, the Croatian Ustaše, and the Serbian nationalist and legitimist factions known as the Chetniks. Tito and his National Liberation Council declared themselves the supreme legislative body in Yugoslavia, prohibited the return of the king, and warmed up to the Allies, which even caused Churchill to shift Allied material support to Tito instead of the Chetniks. Tito compromised with the legitimist government in exile, but made certain that the communists would become the dominant force in Yugoslavia, quickly gaining control over the secret police, the military, and rigging elections in their favor. Not long after, they approved a constitution directly inspired by that of the Soviet Union, and this was about when the reign of Tito would begin. Tito's Yugoslavia was successful, popular among the people, and one of the faster states to rebuild after World War II. Tito split with the Soviets, abandoning the Stalinist model of nationalization, and began to employ what they described as a model of socialist self-management. Unlike the Soviet bloc, Tito's Yugoslavia offered its citizens consumerism that provided a higher standard of living and personal economic mobility, and he pursued a non-aligned political strategy. Yugoslavia industrialized quickly, however, the economy began to lag with time and inefficiencies. Still, the Yugoslav presence in internal geopolitics was highly disproportionate to its actual economic or military power because Tito positioned himself as a mediator between the two superpowers of the Soviet Union and the United States, and also as a leader among the Third World, cultivating ties with Nehru in India and Nasser in Egypt. Because of this, Yugoslavia received $1.2 billion in Western aid between 1949 and 1955, while still being a socialist country. The iconic Yugoslav Red Passport allowed its citizens to travel freely to both the East and the West, a privilege that was nearly unheard of elsewhere in the communist world. Yugoslav workers would also travel abroad, serve as supplementary manpower in foreign countries, and return with foreign currency that continually stabilized Yugoslavia's economy. By the 1970s, many Yugoslavians enjoyed relative prosperity, owned cars, and even second houses, and watched television in color. This prosperity, however, was very regionally disparate. For example, Kosovo's per capita GDP was 1/8 that of Slovenia in the north. This caused some resentment, creating a bureaucratic nationalism of sorts, wherein the productive North felt that the debt-ridden South were a ball and chain dragging the country behind. The resentment wasn't purely ethnic or national in character, though. It was also intrapersonal. The Yugoslav system established workers' councils intended to devolve economic decision-making to the local level. However, this often resulted in the councils just establishing personal cliques rather than genuinely putting the best people in power or making the best decisions. The state was also quite reliant on Tito himself personally to prevent some of these pressures from starting to split apart the various Yugoslav ethnic republics. Tito was the great oak tree in whose shade no other institutions or heirs could grow, a structure that unfortunately ensured the deterioration of federal institutions as he himself declined in his influence. The constitutional framework of the state was basically designed to rely on Tito as a supreme arbiter, because even though it decentralized Yugoslavia to an unprecedented degree, this decentralization was only functional while Tito was alive to override the 8 regional and separate communist parties who themselves had incredibly divergent and often ethnically motivated interests. Without Tito, or an equally powerful and unifying leader in general, to step in and resolve the disagreements through sheer influence, that decentralization became a destructive force. After Tito, who himself failed to designate a credible heir, Yugoslavia was led by a hopelessly inefficient rotating presidency, a gridlocked legislature, and an economy reliant on foreign credit that spun into $21 billion in debt by 1980. The global economy was in a wind down in general at that very moment, and thus economics became the nail in the coffin which erased the ties that Tito built to bind Yugoslavia together, and reverted the status quo back to ethnic and nationalist politics. In Serbia, Slobodan Milošević rose, and he worked against the Kosovans and the autonomy of Vojvodina. Serbia essentially re-centralized its own status within Yugoslavia, and the Slovenes and Croats simply walked out in protest. Nationalists took over everywhere, the Yugoslav army became a force for Serbian interests as non-Serbs abandoned military service, and then the Bosnian Civil War broke out. Germany seemingly prematurely recognized several republics seceding from Yugoslavia, and the state violently broke up over the course of the Yugoslav Wars, resulting in the death of over 130,000 and the displacement of millions more. Widespread ethnic cleansing, the obliteration of the Balkan economies, a NATO intervention, and the lingering ethnic resentment and outright conflict we still see in the Balkans today. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Yugoslavia never broke up? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers in 2026, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our generous channel members. Thank you, and enjoy the video. The first step in keeping Yugoslavia together is to accept the hard truth that the Federation was never properly designed to survive Tito. He was the central load-bearing structure of Yugoslavia. His personal authority broke the gridlock of the bureaucracy. His international stature and his prestige held up the foreign debt economics, and his control over the party and army substituted a well-written constitution. Once he was gone, the rules of the game collapsed so hard because they had never really been written for a world in which he was absent. But of course, Yugoslavia doesn't just need another Tito after Tito himself, because that was never a sustainable solution. You would just need infinite Titos into the future for that to work. The real question is how Yugoslavia might have been gradually re-engineered while Tito was alive, such that power, legitimacy, and economic stability were embedded into the institutions rather than held up by a single man. I think we can achieve this, keeping Yugoslavia intact through the turn of the century while not completely transforming it into something different in its entirety, through 4 main changes. And the first of these changes would come surprisingly early, in the 1950s, just after the Tito-Stalin split. At that moment, Yugoslavia was already improvising, as it had rejected Soviet central planning, embraced self-management, and was searching for a socialist identity that did not depend on the Soviets, kind of like Eurocommunism ahead of the curve. Within this context, there was a group of reformists, including Milovan Djilas, who posed a challenge to Tito's power, but one that may very well have been regenerative if we properly fit it into the Yugoslav political equation. Djilas was the deputy prime minister of Yugoslavia, and he argued that Yugoslavia was headed for a situation where the bureaucrats would control the state's resources without accountability, so he wanted to democratize power in Yugoslavia. In our history, Tito purged Gilas and essentially took control himself to fix the issue of the bureaucrats. However, we might have Tito instead tolerate a restrained version of Gilas's reformism, basically only making use of its emphasis on legal accountability and internal pluralism, and rejecting the elements of his agenda, for example, the tolerance of other political parties, that would be too radical. Tito's political party, the League of Communists, could then have evolved into something closer to a civic, pan-Yugoslav political entity, which eventually would have normalized disagreement within the party, rewarded merit over explicit loyalty to Tito, and prevented the slow hardening of the party elites into mechanisms of their own nationalist interests. For one, this actually seems kind of similar to Japan's political system, wherein the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party essentially serves as an umbrella party for all political factions, and these different factions just sort of rise in power within the party. But also, over many, many decades, these little changes actually matter a lot, because it means you don't see these regional cliques as much, you don't see as many purges of reformists in the 1970s, and Yugoslavia begins to develop a political culture capable of self-correction, especially after Tito, and most importantly, it gives Yugoslavia an ideological backbone that can survive, though certainly not without infighting, instead of leaving behind a vacuum that radical nationalism filled. The second change would be constitutional. Tito and his theorist Edward Cardell decentralized Yugoslavia to an extraordinary degree, particularly because Tito himself could afford to override it. The result was, as we've discussed, a federation that functioned only as long as Tito lived to break the gridlock. Once he died, power fragmented, etc., etc. A more survivable alternative would not necessarily have been re-centralization, which would have reignited the fear of the dominance of one group like the Serbs or the Croats, but a moderated federalism with a stronger federal fiscal authority, a clearer chain of command over the security forces, and a permanent elected federal executive rather than a rotating presidency. This would be politically possible while Tito was alive, especially during moments like the Croatian Spring, when those reformist elites were not yet nationalist separatists, but federalists who wanted to renegotiate the state. By co-opting rather than purging them, Tito could have reinforced the systems under him, and he could still override them based on the inertia of his existing massive influence. Thus, Tito gets his supremacy, and whoever comes after inherits a system that is more grounded, functions better, and can particularly function without Tito at its center. The third change would be economic, and it would need to happen immediately after Tito dies. Yugoslavia's prosperity had always been partly artificial and the product of foreign loans and remittances rather than material production. When the global economy wound down, like we said, Yugoslavia was hurt worse. Ante Markovic, the last prime minister of Yugoslavia, demonstrated in 1989 that the economy was still salvageable and that inflation could be crushed and the currency stabilized and consumer confidence restored, but his reforms just came too late. Assuming our other two previous changes, perhaps Yugoslavia will be stable enough for Markovic's reforms to be implemented and make the changes that will benefit the state into the turn of the century. And then the final change would be international. Yugoslavia's non-aligned status gave it leverage during the Cold War, but once the Cold War ended, that kind of evaporated. Yugoslavia would have needed a new external anchor, which in my opinion would undoubtedly have been conditional integration into the European Economic Community. Western Europe had every strategic reason to support such a project, and Yugoslavia had the credibility to pursue it while reforms were still underway. So these changes would produce plenty of butterfly effects. For starters, by using Gilas, the League of Communists would have begun a slow, controlled transition from a revolutionary guard into something like a technocratic civil service. Tito can still purge the unproductive middle management of the party on the grounds of legalism and accountability because, let's face it, this is still Tito's Yugoslavia. But the ideological muscle memory being built inside the state will now be starting to shift toward one of institutional procedure. I think this also affects how Tito goes about what we know to be the dramatic fall of Aleksandar Vrankovic, the deputy prime minister. Tito will act earlier to strip the secret police of their extra-legal powers, placing security services under the first buds of civilian parliamentary oversight. And all of these are, when they're initially happening, just sort of small procedural adjustments being made, but they have an outsized consequence a decade and a half later in 1968, when Czechoslovakia's Communist Party under Alexander Dubček launches what we know as the Prague Spring. In our history, Dubček's experiment in socialism with human face was crushed by the Soviet invasion in August of that year, justified by the Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted the USSR's right to intervene in any socialist country moving away from orthodox communism. The reformists in Czechoslovakia were in part ideologically improvising because they were trying to articulate a socialism that was both humane and legitimate, but doing so largely without a working model to point to, kind of like if the French revolutionaries had no American revolution to work off of. In this alternate timeline, Yugoslavia has spent 15 years demonstrating that something approximating that model can function. All of these give the Prague reformers a sophisticated ideological framework and a living precedent. This, of course, doesn't guarantee that the Soviets don't invade, because the Brezhnev Doctrine is ultimately a strategic doctrine as much as an ideological one, but the reformists in the broader Eastern Bloc now have a successful, economically viable, internationally respected socialist state that has rejected Stalinism and survived, and thus they can ideologically challenge Moscow far more credibly without immediately being dismissed as Western infiltrators. Whether or not the tanks still roll, this plants ideological seeds in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary and elsewhere. Now, we already explained the removal of Rankovic in Yugoslavia, but because the power vacuum his departure creates is now filled by the parliamentary oversight structures already in place, rather than an unregulated expansion of the security fiefdoms, we will see this model repeated in the Croatian Spring. In our history, Tito crushed the Croatian Spring and purged its leadership, which hardened their nationalist grievances, which would fester for the next 2 decades until they exploded. Again, Tito is still Tito, and he is not going to surrender his authority or permit outright separatism, but the institutional reforms already in motion give him a framework within which to co-opt some of these figures in the same way that he co-opted Gilas. He can grant Croatia and other republics meaningful economic autonomy in exchange for federal fiscal unity. This gives Yugoslavia the template for a new constitutional structure that Tito and Edvard Kardelj can spend the early 1970s redesigning, which is where our second change comes in. We'll shift the unworkable rotating presidency into a more stable federal chancellor, elected by the federal parliament with genuine executive authority over fiscal policy and the security services. And it also sets up something that can survive bureaucratically after Tito. Of course, Tito still retains his supremacy while he's alive through sheer inertia and prestige, but now he is doing so above a federation that is designed to function after him. So within a decade, that becomes incredibly important, because on May 4th, 1980, at 87 years old, Tito passed away. Even as the country mourns his passings, the institutions would hold. The federal parliament would convene to elect the first federal chancellor, and it would probably be someone from the reformist wing of the League of Communists, perhaps even Ante Markovic, whose economic instincts would be well suited for this Yugoslavia that has endured reform. And Markovic, instead of a doctor trying to treat a patient that basically had a huge bullet wound through their head, he would now, in this timeline, be treating a Yugoslavia that was just slightly economically ill. In our own history, Markovic's genuine and largely successful stabilization program of pegging the dinar to the German mark, crushing hyperinflation, liberalizing trade, and restoring consumer confidence came in 1989, which is far too late, when the political fabric of the country was already tearing apart. Now, we're seeing these reforms in a stable Yugoslavia, and in the early 1980s, when the $21 billion debt is painful but not a death sentence. Yugoslavia would also have functioning courts and a good track record, which makes the Western banks and the IMF extend more favorable terms to help the country out. We should also note that Western Europe has every reason to want a stable, non-aligned, reforming socialist state on its southeastern flank, with the Soviet Union still an ongoing concern, because it stabilizes the Balkans, and tying their recovery to Western aid allows them to start to extend economic influence further into the East. During this time, the 1984 Sarajevo Winter Olympics would have occurred. Sarajevo would be showcased to 2 billion viewers as a decently modern city in a reforming Balkan tiger of sorts. The Sarajevo Winter Games were the first Olympic Games hosted by a socialist state that actually didn't have a boycott by other countries, and that it would supercharge Yugoslavia's international prestige, and in this timeline provide it with a soft power that it perhaps would not have as much of with the death of Tito. This economic stability has other political consequences too that cannot be overstated, because it prevents the 1990 Serbian raid on the federal monetary system. In our own history, Serbia's Republican government simply printed money and seized the federal currency reserves, an act of economic sabotage that destroyed the convertible dinar and also made a coherent and unified Yugoslav response to the crisis impossible. In our scenario, a federal executive with genuine fiscal authority and a functioning constitutional court has the tools to penalize exactly this kind of unilateral defection from the Serbs. When Slobodan Milošević begins his ascent in the late 1980s, using the Kosovo crisis as a vehicle for Serbian nationalist mobilization, he won't be able to hijack the system. The courts would rule his unilateral revocation of Kosovo's and Vojvodina's autonomy unconstitutional. The Yugoslav People's Army would have been professionalized and thus would not be allowed to drift into an ethnically Serbian officer corps and would stay on the side of the central authority instead of aligning with Milošević. Milošević will probably just end up as a capable and fringe populist who will win Serbian Republican elections but won't be able to dismantle Yugoslavia as a whole. Now, by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev would have come into power in the Soviet Union and began his twin programs of Glasnost and Perestroika. In our history, Gorbachev was doing the same thing as the Prague Spring reformists, trying to reform a system that had no successful template for what he was attempting. But here again, we have a stable, prosperous Yugoslav federation that's been around for 30-some-odd years. It has internal party pluralism, it has rule of law, and its integration into the Western economic order while remaining non-aligned is exactly the kind of model that Gorbachev was sort of trying to veer toward. His reformers could study it openly, which makes perestroika perhaps less of a shot in the dark. The problem is, the structural issues with the Soviet system run far deeper than any model could fix, especially when we look at the crises that eroded their foreign currency reserves and hard cash surpluses after wars and oil price fluctuations in the Middle East. So even with a more functional perestroika, reform just isn't going to save the Soviet Union. Now, if you do want to dive really deep into a look on how we could prevent the Soviet Union's collapse, I do have a video on that goes very in-depth and is very well made, if I do say so myself. But for our purposes, though, we'll still see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989 and the Eastern European Revolution sweep the continent. Here, Yugoslavia gets to watch all of this happen also from a position of relative stability. It would probably be around this time that we also see the League of Communists start to split apart into actual different political parties, with Tito now about a decade past. Socialists, hardliners, liberals, and nationalists, who would have before just been factions within the League of Communists, would now split off into new parties at the federal and republican level. By 1991, as we said, Yugoslavia would also sign an association agreement with the European Economic Community. Given Yugoslavia's existing industrial base, its convertible currency, its history of Western trade relations, and the absence of the shock that decollectivization imposed on the Eastern Bloc economies, it would start off decently strong in the EEC. We would see no Yugoslav Wars in the 1990s, and the newly unified Germany would support Yugoslavia for the same strategic reasons it had tried to in our own history, that being that a stable southeastern Europe is good for German trade, and a Yugoslavia integrated into European institutions is a buffer against the instability spreading westward from the collapsing Iron Curtain. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which transformed the EEC into the European Union, would include Yugoslavia at the negotiating table. And the debates over Maastricht in our own history were almost entirely about existing member states and their currencies and sovereignty questions. But the question of Yugoslavia's membership, of course, now adds a dimension to the conversation about what European integration means for multi-ethnic and, most importantly, for post-socialist states. A conversation that will prove incredibly useful when the EU begins seriously considering the addition of Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and the rest of the Eastern Bloc. The Kosovo question would also be managed within the framework of the European Minority Rights Conventions. Kosovo is, of course, still a very tough situation because of the demographic and historical tensions there, and these tensions don't just disappear in this timeline because of European bureaucracy, but the combination of federal protection for minority rights, economic development funds through the EEC, and the political incentive for all parties to remain within a system that is generating prosperity, the Yugoslav system, means that the Kosovo crisis of the late 1980s and 1990s becomes a political and legal issue and not a military one. So we don't get NATO bombing raids, and we just get more of a political crisis. It's not the best outcome because it still has a destabilizing effect at home, but it doesn't mean we're bombing Yugoslavia. This also has a consequence that reaches outside of the Balkans. In our own history, Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008 after the NATO intervention established the precedent that Russia cited explicitly when it recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia after the 2008 Georgia War, and again when it annexed Crimea in 2014. The logic which Kosovo created was that a region could unilaterally separate from a sovereign state with external great power support. But with an intact Yugoslavia, that precedent is never set. This also affects NATO. The NATO alliance found a lot of its post-Cold War purpose through the Bosnian and Kosovan interventions, as they justified its continued existence after the Soviet threat was just gone. Here, without those wars, NATO might weaken or shift its focus from security to some other function, or perhaps cease to exist in its entirety. Yugoslavia during this time will be the economic hub of southeastern Europe, with a growing auto manufacturing sector and a growing GDP, not at the pace of something like the East Asian miracle, but something comparable to Portugal or Poland, which is to say, meaningful and consistent. Yugoslavia's per capita income would be approaching the lower tier of EU averages, and it would have national infrastructure. It wouldn't have that brain drain we saw, and it would have a strong political system that can tackle issues like the North-South tension, the Macedonian question, the status of Bosnian Muslims, and the debate over Vojvodina autonomy. Arguments in courtrooms and in parliaments would play on color television instead of blasts of artillery in the Dinaric Alps. 130,000 people who died in the Yugoslav Wars of our own history would be spared. Millions more who were displaced would be at home. The generation that grew up in the rubble of Sarajevo and Vukovar and Vojvodina would instead grow up in an imperfect system with their own political frustrations, but in an intact country, which by the standards of what actually happened, is actually an extraordinary outcome. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.